Welcome to our webinar, Making Partnerships Work for Cities and for Smart Solution Providers. What are the key ingredients to success? We have an exciting group of speakers here, Gordon Feller, who is the founder of Meeting of the Minds, and our own Chris Davis, who leads our Smart City initiatives here at SimCon. And with that, I will pass it off to Chris.
Thank you, Liz. So Gordon, we're glad to have you participate. You've been knocking around in the smart city space, probably for longer than Liz is old, just kidding. But anyway, let's get started. As you know, when you're looking at smart cities, cities are often challenged by paying for the applications they want to implement. And there are many types of funding schemes for smart infrastructure and smart lighting solutions. One that seems to be gaining a lot of momentum lately is public-private partnerships. Can you please describe for our listeners what PPPs are?
Thanks for the intro, Elizabeth and Chris, and I'm glad to join you here. Basically, any kind of collaborative arrangement that links public sector and private sector, either on a contract basis or maybe a joint institution has been created that's greater than a contract. That collaborative arrangement, is a public-private partnership. And you can see from the slide that I have up on the screen that the government brings to the table something quite different than the private company brings. And the idea always is that there's an end user somewhere, the citizen of that city or that county or that state or that country, or maybe it's a visitor, that they get a benefit. So you can see, that the bottom line here is the benefits flow to both parties, which is crucial in this arrangement, simply because it wouldn't work otherwise. So I'll give an example. Government X decides they want to transfer some risk into this collaborative arrangement. They want to transfer an asset. Maybe it's parking spaces or parking meters. Usually it's both, or outdoor streetlights or any number of other government-owned assets. And the duty to operate it is transferred by the government to this collaborative arrangement. The private company is bringing their operating responsibility and expertise. Their knowledge is being transferred into that collaborative arrangement, which makes it possible, obviously, for them to operate it. But they're also bringing capital investment, and they're generating fees. And those fees are being paid by end users, some of which are organizations and some of which are individuals. And the reason they're willing to pay fees that make the whole thing go round and round is there's a service being delivered or a product being delivered, and that product is in many cases being developed and delivered by the private company, which the government feels is not their role. They may have delivered that service in the past, like transportation and mobility services, but they've decided that in that particular domain, maybe it's mass transit, or maybe it's specialized not so mass transit, paratransit in some cases. They may feel that service delivery is better performed by the private companies. So Keolis, for instance, the French company, or Veolia, the French company, they made a multi-billion-dollar business and succeed very, very well with this type of structure. But not every company in the world, is got 150 to 200 years of experience like the French companies do in this model. So the reality is that public-private partnerships in some countries are much more developed than others. UK, Canada, Australia, very, very well developed. In US, not so much, but that may be changing.
Gordon, just on that point, what have been some of the inhibitors for public-private partnerships not gaining momentum here in North America, where they seem to be more common in Asia-Pac and in Europe?
Well, one challenge here in the US is that very often the companies who would be bidding on these projects and want to be engaged discover that the scope of work is unclear, too broad, not well defined enough to help them define the risk. Because the key of this, of course, is the private company is willing to take risks, which is obviously to the benefit of the public entity, which wants to share the risk that they already own. And the reason the private company is willing to step up is they can define the risk in a way that gives them a pretty clear sense over 5, 10, 15, 20 years of the life of that public-private partnership in a city or a county or a state or a stadium or whatever that might be, they're able to define that so they can finance it. Another reason is the lack of accountability in the governance, or maybe the lack of clarity about accountability and governance. That's caused some real headaches, and you have to have a pretty clear way of governing the whole affair and the whole partnership. And also, the third element, which is a real challenge, is how to measure the impact early, so that the the interventions, course corrections, modifications can be made. You want to be able to measure those impacts with a lot of certainty and clarity of shared definition between the public and the private about what are the metrics. And sometimes in the US, those have been kind of mushy. We also, of course, have the persistent problem of every electoral cycle, the game changes when the person in the mayor's chair or the city council executive chair changes. In other countries, they've been able to create a national PPP legal structure that helps reduce that problem of only local laws apply in the US.
Okay. So that's interesting. Do you see any variation between, let's say, the countries in the Americas, let's say Canada, US, Mexico, and then Latin America?
Canada is by far the most successful, and maybe they're the most successful globally. This slide here, I'm kind of listing what the long-term arrangements are. This is actually a list that I drew up when I looked at what the Canadian success stories are. And let me give a couple of examples. So in Canada, there's been more than 70 billion Canadian dollars of capital invested over the last 10 years in 200 plus infrastructure projects that have been delivered. It's been a major commitment of the politicians who govern the country. And as a result, there's been a very stable pipeline, which of course helps maintain the efficient capacity to deliver these projects and to get multiple bidders who are, competing against each other, which the public sector wants to see that because it reduces the cost on the public sector side. But that stable pipeline means the banks and the insurers who are putting their capital at risk alongside somebody operating a system, they like the stable pipeline because they can see this as an asset category that complements what they're doing in real estate or what they're doing in venture capital or what they're doing in stocks and bonds. So the efficient procurement system the Canadians built has been really, I would say, nothing short of amazing, right? So their procurement time over the whole program period, let's say a 10-year program, the bid costs are lower than comparable. And I can give some numbers if people are interested in places like Australia. So that's on Canada. Mexico has had more of a struggle. Obrador has said that he wants to do more of this, particularly as he, shifts the big, wealthy concentration of political power away from the big corporates like Pemex. That's obviously going to be a slower process, but the process of reducing Pemex's power in the energy sector and the comparable shift in the electric utility sector, that may actually result in some pretty cool things happening. But I want to go back and talk about smart cities just for a minute. And the next slide will help. So you can see here, and you can study these slides afterwards, that there are a lot of different forms that participation by the private sector can take in managing and improving public entities, public facilities. And I want to give an example. So here's, oh gosh, where is it in my notes? Yeah, so if a smart city, is going to be a breakthrough innovation for a city, it's going to have to deliver measurable impacts. And that means when you layer on applications and new devices onto existing infrastructure, whether it's existing outdoor, the cities are looking to get outcomes, right? They're applying the technology to their big categories like mobility or security or electric if they own the municipal utility or water. They want this to be adopted and used to reduce OPEX, to reduce their CAPEX, and to get citizens engaged. And the reason that the public-private partnership model is turning out to be feasible in places like Canada, Europe, particularly EU members, Australia, New Zealand, is it's a way of financing that smartening up of the infrastructure, and it's a way for cities to trade off control and ownership and to transfer the risk, and to reduce their part of the capital requirements of projects. And I was reading a couple of weeks ago a presentation by McKinsey Global Institute, and they said that in their view, and they've been studying these PPPs for smart cities for a while, whatever the form happens to be, and I list a bunch of the formats that can be taken, they think there are more than 45 assets and services that could be candidates for public-private partnerships in cities. So here on my slide, I'm trying to list in some kind of systematic, easy visual way what the big challenges are, no matter what country you're in. And the higher cost of finance usually sits with the private sector. The P3s are longer term, so you have to have a structure, and that means something that's relatively inflexible. It's not going to change. The procurement process can be lengthy and costly, but when we talk about Pune, India, I'll describe an example that's not on these slides, but that might be helpful to look at a procurement system that was faster, and that the P3, does imply some loss of control by the public agencies. So that often results in some what would I call it, citizen pushback. And that's what Alphabet and Google are seeing with Sidewalk Labs in Toronto. And when we get time, we can talk about their P3 model and why it may not work.
Yeah, so this is an interesting, looking at the slide you just showed, Gordon. If you look at Europe, you have negative interest rates, and the interest rates here are quite low. So I'm just wondering if that's an impediment or an impetus for cities to enter into, and private investors in particular, to enter into these public-private partnerships.
I think actually for those who are looking to, as investors or lenders, to expand the number of asset classes where they can make money on a reliable, return, even if it's not 8%, that they may be getting in real estate around the world, since real estate has become a global boom industry, at least for the moment, until the next downturn. If they're looking to hedge their bets on that, and they want 3%, 4% annual return on a 10 to 20 year project, this is what the Australian insurers and pension funds, the Canadian insurers and pension funds have said they're most attracted to P3s for this reason. They see these types of infrastructure project financing opportunities for them as a better way to utilize their capital right now.
Okay, makes sense. Great. So you're back to some of the challenges you see. So you've got some listed here. What are some of the other challenges that are faced in terms of getting these public-private partnerships off the ground?
Well, one of them, of course, is amazingly high expectations. So, the expectations, for instance, in Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, which has been getting a lot of attention recently, let's just talk about that for a moment. They spent, almost 2 years priming the pump and raising the volume and creating amazing expectations of breakthroughs that were coming at Google Alphabet expense. Well, if you look at the master plan, which they've now published, 2,000 pages, here's the summary of what they propose. They want to put $3.9 billion of investment into Quayside, which is the waterfront Toronto facility that they were invited to their competitive bid. Plus, they want to do an urban innovation hub on the western portion of the neighboring island, which is called Villiers Island. And they're willing to share 10% over 20 years with the government of any profits that result from the innovations that emerge, since they're going to use this as a living lab to experiment on the residents and citizens and visitors in this district on the waterfront, on the lake. So the commitments that Sidewalk Labs are making are $900 million equity investment toward that $3.9 billion budget, phase one. Another $400 million to accelerate development of the light rail transit to the neighborhood. Another $10 million seed funding for a new urban innovation institute. Plus, they want to be appointed the lead developer, the technical partner, and the advisor. And in exchange, they want a land purchase price that, quote, fairly accounts for heightened public policy outcomes required. They want to be, quote, reimbursed over time for advisory and implementation services. And they want the Sidewalk Lab expenses that are incurred in delivery of the technical and advisory services to be reimbursed. Plus, they want to earn performance payments to be negotiated at a later date. And they will charge corresponding fees in order to implement the comprehensive innovation and development strategy and to use the products developed and designed by Sidewalk Labs. They get corresponding IP sharing provisions for certain technologies. So they say that in exchange for all that deal, they think they can create 93,000 new jobs, 14.2 billion in annual GDP output. That's new output, additional output, plus $4.3 billion of annual tax revenue, all by 2040. So anyway, that's a pretty ambitious goal. Of course, Google/Alphabet is a company with unusual capacity to finance. I'd say, you know, one of the wealthiest companies in the world that's not Saudi Aramco. But the point is that they created very high expectations, and now that people are working through the 2,000 pages, the pushback by citizens, by elected officials, by appointed officials, by competitors is huge. Lawsuits, public campaigns, and it may never happen. So that's a big impediment because a lot of expectations are being put on these P3 shoulders, and whether or not they can achieve those goals when they're promised over the life of the project, you know, the public is expecting that that's going to happen in exchange for the risk being shared and the revenues being shared.
So could that be one of the challenges, having goals that are too lofty?
Yes,
You know.
on both sides, because the Waterfront Toronto people started with overambitious goals as well. And so it wasn't only Alphabet, Google that and Sidewalk Labs, their subsidiary, that made the mistake of raising amazing expectations, but it was also on the buyer side, essentially, with Waterfront Toronto.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So, you know, when you look at, here we got some other issues. I was just going to go into that. So talk about some of these other issues in terms of, you know, how do you get started and how do you raise this commercial financing with respect to a PPP?
So the big challenge, of course, for every P3, smart cities especially, because you've got assets that have been in play for a long time. Unlike, let's say, a new bridge or a new road or a new tunnel as a P3, because it's a new asset. With a P3 smart city, you're often dealing with existing assets like the light poles or the parking space or the parking meter. And this is where the banks get a little nervous because they're looking at, do they finance a business that already exists in a different way than already the structures exist for? And banks who don't have experience doing that tend to be shy. And when you have too many banks being shy, the cost of the financing rises because there are fewer players willing to make their bids. Supply and demand.
Yeah.
Projects, of course, are less affordable if you're doing it first time. Not just less affordable financing, but less affordable on the operations and maintenance of the project. And a lot of the proposals for P3s come from newbies who don't know, as SimCon does on smart lighting and all the requirements that come with implementing a smart lighting program, and SimCon's got a lot of expertise doing that in many different types of cities. There are new players in this space who don't know what the true cost is going to be, including the total cost of ownership of that system for 10 years. And then finally, you know, the ideal scenario is the government provides sufficient support. And that's not just verbal support from an executive who says, I love P3s. There has to be a real government guarantee on the risk side of some kind, not guaranteeing the profit margin, because that would be politically unacceptable, and frankly, it's not necessary. But there may be some gap funding that the government needs to step in for, because there's a period of time during the ramp up on new technology being implemented where there's no revenue being generated that can apply toward the P3, just to take that one example. So Minimum revenue guarantees are sometimes demanded by the private side. They're not often getting it. But one reason they do it is that they believe that it's easier for them to measure. I'm not wildly enthusiastic about that because it smells like it's not the fairest deal for the citizens who are taxpayers who paid for those parking spaces and parking meters in years past.
On the issue, Gordon, on the issue of government support, have you ever seen a circumstance where there's a PPP in place, or let's say in the formative stages, and the administration changes, and the new administration coming in says, "Oh, I'm going to take it back"?
It almost happened in Kansas City, where you had a P3 RFP that winds its way over several years to a conclusion, and then the new mayoral administration pulls the plug. So it almost happened in that case. There wasn't a final P3 contract signed with the winner of that competition. But I think you and some of your colleagues were privy to all of the energy and time and money that bidders had put into the Kansas City P3 Smart City program, and you almost got to the place where that had been signed. I guess fortunately the plug was pulled on the whole endeavor before any contract was signed. But a short list had been created and a lot of money and time and effort and sweat had been expended. There have been some high profile P3s that blew up. Bechtel, the largest, I guess they're the third largest privately held company in the United States after Koch Industries and maybe one other. That San Francisco-based engineering and construction company did a Bolivian water P3 that blew up in their face. And that's a fascinating story where I think it was, essentially privatization run amok, couched as a P3 arrangement.
Yeah. So Gordon, can we move along and talk a little bit about, what types of public-private partnerships are in play? Which ones are common? How do they work?
Yep. I think, I'll pick an example from Pune if I could. While I put up the success factor slide, you can see a couple of the instances here. So those who are not familiar with this program in Pune, India, it's a big city, 330 plus square kilometers with a, fast growing population, nearly 4 million plus, and a GDP of $50 billion plus. So they succeeded on the planning, on the execution. They were ranked number 2 in India during the national government's Smart Cities project selection process. And then on the execution over the last 3 years, they were ranked number 2 success story. So basically, in these 6 that you see here, large scale investment, private partner has the expertise, et cetera, all of these ingredients were pretty much represented in Pune. You had the following pieces of the puzzle. And by the way, the program is called Smart Element. And they created a new company called the Pune Smart City Development Corporation. They wanted to build an operations center. They wanted to deploy Wi-Fi in the city. They wanted environmental sensor network, 50 plus stations. They wanted a new public address system, 125 plus stations. They wanted emergency boxes for a new emergency response system. And they wanted a variable messaging system, 150 plus locations. So those were the pieces of Smart Element. And they wanted a 5-year contract to design, build, implement, operate, and maintain. And they wanted over those 5 years for the winner, and this was competitive tender, a very fast competitive tender. The whole process from start to finish, from birth to launch, was 3 to 4 months. They wanted over 5 years to have somebody provide all the network bandwidth to operate and maintain the entire command center, operations center for 5 years. They wanted all the CapEx payments to be made on a prearranged milestone schedule. And they wanted the CapEx payments, basically to come quarterly, subject to the compliance with the SLA. So, most of it has been implemented, more than 90%, and it's been a big success because they had all 6 of these ingredients in the mix. And I think the folks in Toronto, Waterfront Toronto, who are going to sign a contract with somebody, if they go forward at all, are going to have to basically, recognize, yes, it is a large-scale investment. Yes, there are private partners out there that have the expertise, but on the other 4, it's a question mark.
Got it. So let's talk about some of the types of public-private partnerships that are in place.
Yeah, I tried to describe what would you call that? A thermometer from the simple at the basic level to the most complex. And the formal JV structure between a public and a private entity, which is, I guess you'd call it an institutional arrangement because you're creating a new institution, versus a reciprocal contract where you simply have the private sector engage. And there it's a maximization of the public asset utilization. And there are successes and failures up and down this whole spectrum of really 4 different varieties that I tend to focus on. And in the papers that you'll read, some I've written, some others, you'll see examples galore. And these slides, we don't have much time to go through a lot more examples beyond Toronto and Pune, India. But for those who come back and want more, these slides will include, I think, maybe I added 3 or 4 toward the end that I'll just simply highlight as we get to them. But each of these comes with different levels of challenge. So for instance, the joint venture is a new structure. It's going to have a new board. It's going to have a new governance, a new charter. There's a lot more legal process to creating a new joint venture than simply a contract for outsourcing operations and for managing the O&M.
So they sort of run in between. So you would consider the joint venture to be a marriage where the outsourcing is, okay, we're just going out on a date maybe, right?
Yes, I mean, this is what we used to call them in high school, the bases, right? So first base, second base, third base, home run.
All right. Here you've got a ground lease, so explain what that is.
Well, this is obviously for smart cities one possible scenario where you're granting the leasing rights, and the idea is the public sector owns that land, and this is to some extent, the model that the folks in Toronto may have had in mind initially before they got the 2,000-page proposal from Sidewalk Labs. But the idea is, there are developers, and that's where the role that Alphabet Google wants to play, who will operate the systems. And then they're going to have tenants and buyers who are coming along. And that's why, Alphabet, Google, Sidewalk Labs have decided that they want to be in that middle position because they expect that that's the ideal position to be in. And instead of a lease, they may propose to actually buy the land, which I think is the format that they're proposing. But it'll probably wind up being a lease because the idea is there's a defined number of years to the arrangement. But this is something that's been tried and true in many different parts of the world. And of course, banks understand leases. Banks understand real estate development. So to some extent, a smart city project that's built around real estate is the easiest. The harder one, of course, is services that are not tied to a particular piece of property. And that's where a concession comes in. And a concession arrangement, essentially, as many of us on the webinar have seen, can fall apart if the performance doesn't live up to the promise. And that that might include construction commitments or financing commitments along the way, which the concessionaire who wins the award has to essentially commit to with penalties if they don't bring, and many of those have fallen apart because the penalties weren't strong enough to essentially the concessionaire. They looked at this, they said, wow, we totally underestimated what we're going to have to put into this, and we're not going to make any money in this project, so we're going to walk away and take the hit on the penalty. And that has happened, and that's where the service agreements become much more problematic. And I tried to describe here, and I'm not going to go through this because time is of the essence for our questioners, but you have a lot of different options, and I picked out 2 for the funding mechanisms, the funding mechanics, I guess, the financial engineering, which is described in this slide. But you can also have a BOT model, which has been tried and true, and many construction and engineering companies are now ready to use a BOT model where they transfer at the end of the life of that contract. And usually it's a construction engineering company that's deep in the mix, if not at the heart of it, because they know what it's like to deliver the end result because they've done it before, maybe not on a BOT, maybe they simply did it on a straight contract with a client, but now they're willing to consider BOT for that business. So that's you know, different approaches to slice and dice this, and the question of, you know, appetite is who has the risk appetite for a different model, because all three models represent different levels of risk.
Gordon, can you talk about who are the players involved in these types of public-private partnerships, you know, both on the private sector side and the public sector side, and especially on the public sector side, who are the kingpins in this?
Well, I can name names, you know, like Bechtel or their competitors at Halliburton, or the better ones that I think are working much more diligently and with a higher level of integrity, like the folks at Black & Veatch, who don't often get involved in joint ventures, and when they do, you know, they're really committed to delivering on the outcomes, and they've proven themselves to be capable of that. So in the mobility universe, now not talking about construction of infrastructure or reconstruction of infrastructure, but more mobility services, you know, you've got companies that are long-standing players like Keolis, new players that are very well financed like Via, who are operating in West Sacramento and in many other cities around the United States, and now I think outside the US, where they're delivering, you know, a public-private partnership. But new players are entering in the telecom space, like Verizon is doing in Sacramento. And I made some notes about the Sacramento partnership because I think it's certainly worth mentioning. You know, there were essentially four big elements. The city wanted Wi-Fi solutions delivered, service capacity installed and delivered in neighborhoods that have been traditionally underreached. They wanted intelligent transportation systems and intelligent data services, especially at key intersections. They wanted public safety solutions, both for law enforcement, but also for Vision Zero programs to reduce the number of accidents and fatalities that affect pedestrians. And they wanted 5G connectivity. And so they signed a public-private partnership, which is all public domain documentation, with Mayor Darrell Steinberg. And that has been a success. $100 million plus commitment from the Verizon side, and other commitments from the city government. On October 3rd in Sacramento, Meeting of the Minds is convening another program there to talk about all the variety of things that are happening in cities like Sacramento with these kinds of public-private partnerships around smart city development. I would say that, you know, one of the lessons from Sacramento is it takes longer to do these things than everybody at the table believes. Everybody wants it to happen ASAP. The problem is you're working through government systems and corporate systems that don't necessarily move as fast as the executives who run it want it to move. And so, you know, that's a big lesson. But in terms of players, names of players, it's a very long list. Some European like Siemens, some US based, but like GE, which once upon a time was doing this in the lighting sphere, and I believe now they're moving out of that business entirely. But the bottom line is that you'll find many different flavors and varieties of players. The real question is which bank behind them, or insurer behind them, or pension fund behind them is willing to participate in the financing and share that financial risk, as well as share the upside. And there, many US banks have experience in Europe, Australia, Canada, UK, but less so in the US. And that's an impediment to some of the companies like Simcon that would like to finance these things in a more creative way than simply out of your own checkbook.
All right, Gordon, I'll ask two more questions, make them brief, and then we can turn it over to the audience. Can you maybe present a couple of public-private partnerships that you're familiar with, highlight one or two, and we certainly have others, I'm sure, that we can send out with, you know, the recording and this slide deck. It'd be nice if you could talk about some, and let's say one good one and one bad one.
All right, so one good one, this was, you know, a new public-private partnership in Rwanda's capital city. It's a fast-growing capital city. Rwanda's national economy is fast-growing. They wanted to bring the private sector in to diversify and improve the water supply. They needed a new plant with the capacity to supply 500,000 plus people in Kigali. That meant 40 million liters of fresh, clean water a day. They turned to a company called Betito, and that basically the project was powered by the Ministry of Infrastructure, which has a Water and Sanitation Corporation, which basically was going to offtake the whole of the production, which essentially is like a power purchase agreement for a solar or wind project. It makes the whole thing go round and round. So the investment was 60 million. There were two multilateral entities that have low-cost capital, Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund and the Africa Development Bank. They took on 40 million of the 60. And then there was debt that essentially provided the rest. And they got a grant from something that the World Bank runs called the Private Infrastructure Development Group. But the idea was the international financial institutions came in to not only provide funding and to help with the competitive selection of investors and to help on the whole due diligence, but also essentially to provide a soft guarantee. So they closed basically November 2017. After a year-long process, the new water treatment plant starts operating in 2020. And, you know, 1/3 of Kigali's water. So that was the first competitively tendered water build, operate, transfer concession in sub-Saharan Africa, not including South Africa, which has its own story. So that was a positive example. I'm skipping over Romania for the Bucharest water project. I'm skipping over Cairo for their wastewater plant in Egypt. I'm skipping over the West Bank and Gaza for solid waste. I'm skipping over the solid waste in Minas Gerais for Brazil because I want to talk about this project, Berhampur in India. So basically this project failed because the party that really was the private sector partner, one of India's leading environmental engineering companies called UPL Environmental Engineers Limited, wanted to do this very badly. They were willing to participate in the funding structure, as you can see there. And ultimately, they decided that they had too many disagreements with the partner, the contracting entity of the Indian state of Odisha and the municipal corporation of Berhampur. So there you had essentially leadership that had different expectations on each side of the table. They got pretty far along. The World Bank Group, through the International Finance Corporation arm of the World Bank, was, you know, advising the municipal corporation of the city for the project. And I think basically they couldn't come to an agreement about how much profit the UPL folks had to take out of it. And it's a desperate situation if you visit Indian cities that don't have this kind of concession. The waste, I mean, I took a picture there just to give you an illustration. The waste is pretty severe. So I'm thinking, you know, you've got two very different examples here of a success that's going to deliver much needed fresh water to a fast growing city and a fast growing economy. And then you've got a real wasted effort, if you pardon the phrase.
All right. One real quick short question with a short answer, hopefully. What's a typical investment size for projects like these? What would be a kind of the normal range? Do you have any feel for that?
This type of project, a solid waste management project for a growing city.
No, I'm just talking about in general for PPPs.
Oh,
like
God, the short answer is every category is different. Transport infrastructure, you know, roads and bridges and tunnels, or airports or seaports, obviously they're big ticket items. These smaller, like waste collection services delivery, much cheaper. So it varies from $10–15 million to $200 million to sometimes $500 million. So it's very, very varied, which from a bank's point of view is kind of interesting because they may have a portfolio where they want a diverse range of options for different types of risk.
Got it. All right, so why don't we stop here? Thank you very much, Gordon. We'll turn it over to Liz for any questions we might have from the audience. I know there have been a few that have come in.
Great. This first question actually segues well with this topic here. So Gordon, if you could talk about how In your experience, how long before cities usually see return on some of these investments they're making with their private partners?
Well, again, it's kind of back to the question that Chris first asked. So if we're talking smart city services, like for instance what JC2Co does with bus shelters, where they take over the bus shelter and they take over the advertising on the bus shelter in exchange for a contract obligation to manage and maintain that over the life of the concession, to clean it, to make sure that it's lit, to make sure that there's wireless connectivity and other obligations that they take on in these many cities where JC2Co does this with outdoor bus shelters, and now they do it with street furniture. I would think that you're talking about, in their promise, a year, right? So the turnaround of those systems, because the new revenue being generated from the new ad streams that are being delivered to those digital kiosks called bus shelters, can be immediate. And if there's a revenue share, the city may see some of that right away. If there's no revenue share, the city will see the other achieved goals, like cleaner, well-lit, better maintained bus shelters on a what would I call it, a scorecard that they use. And they tend to have in the contract a very rigorous scorecard where they ask an independent party, usually in the Department of Public Works, to go and do spot inspections, and if there's a certain percentage of spot inspections that show a failure rate by JC2Co, they will get dinged.
Great. Do you have any advice for smaller cities that might have a little bit less bargaining power on how to initiate some conversations with potential private partners?
Yes, I would say that it's a lot easier than people think. That when I look at what Darrell Steinberg did, that resulted in the Verizon public-private partnership, as mayor, he basically said not everything needs to be done on a competitive bidding RFP. We can do things by law and by smarts that allow us to go beyond competitive bidding, beyond RFP. And so I'm going to call the telcos, and I'm going to tell Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, and maybe some others, you guys should come to me with your proposals. Here are the things that we want. And some cities do this in a call to action, a challenge. They say, we're ready to hear your proposals, and we will respond quickly and fairly. And we're not going to put this in a competitive bid, but may the best man bring the best proposal, and then the best man or woman will win. And so it can be as easy as the mayor making a speech saying, I hereby declare that our city wants to hear from public-private partnerships in the following categories of sponsors and partners. Come to us with your propositions. We're not going to put an RFP out. We're going to basically speed up the whole process and ask you for what you have to offer based on your experience. And we will give you a fair and quick response to proceed down the road or to stop the conversation early, so we don't spin your wheels and waste your time or our time. So for any city that hasn't been down this road, or county or regional agency, this is one way to do it, is just stand up and say, hey, you folks in this business, in shared mobility or in smart outdoor streetlights, here are our interest areas. We want 7,000 of our smart outdoor streetlights to perform better than they are. Here's what it costs us today. And disclose the information. It will result in a response. That's the beautiful thing about the demand side on this. There are lots of interested parties who are demanding opportunities, but they're not seeing a lot of mayors or city council people or heads of agencies stand up and say, bring me your best.
Interesting. Gordon, do you think that is true globally or just in the US? This question is specifically about the EU. Do the same rules apply?
The EU rules, of course, are much more stringent about competitive bidding because of the anti-corruption momentum. And of course, they're trying to, make the process not just transparent, accountable, and legal with a high level of integrity, but they want to encourage more players to have a more predictable process. The part of what I described a moment ago is that it's not so predictable city to city. So if I'm in Cincinnati, it's not going to look the same in Kent, Ohio, or in Cleveland, or in Akron, unless there was a state level legislative initiative for all municipalities in the state of Ohio that the governor and the mayors put together jointly, which could very well create the conditions for a more predictable format. So that downside of just raise your hand and say what you want is that some of the players will say, gosh, we don't really know the rules of the road here too well, so it's hard for us to predict what we're getting into, and that creates hesitancy. So in Europe, they have a very fat rule book on these public procurements, and there's not much wiggle room in their legal system for this type of model. But Chris, you spent a lot of time in Northern Europe, like Estonia, with utilities, and I know you recently spent some time with the Estonian utility. Was there some discussion, Chris, about what they're doing on both public and private investment in smart grid infrastructure and smart outdoor lighting, for example?
That was an interesting topic, and basically what they decided to do was they do not own the streetlights. They maintain them and obviously sell power for the various cities. But they were looking at actually providing funding to the cities, based upon their cash flow, and then just charging the cities, a monthly fee for the lights. So it was to generate a recurring revenue stream. I think their longer-term strategy was to deploy fiber on that streetlight infrastructure, overhead, and then have bandwidth that they could sell to private citizens and other service providers, and also to deploy 5G cells on that streetlight infrastructure. So it would be somewhat subsidized, and the big return would be on the communications infrastructure that they were going to deploy.
Great. We'll get to one last question, and if there's anyone who did not get answers to their questions, we'll be sure to reach out with you after this program. This last question is, who typically builds the business case development for smart city efforts? For example, if it's a private-public partnership, then who are the parties involved building that business case?
Well, on the city side, and I hope Chris will chime in here as I finish up here. I want to hand it off to Chris for his comments. So certainly you have the city government on the smart city side of the equation with their chief information officer, chief data officer, chief technology officer, whatever that title is, plus the chief innovation officer usually. And you get somebody usually from the transit agency or the Department of Transportation at the table, because very, very often mobility is at the top of the list, whether it's tracking the flow of traffic beneath the camera or the sensor, or delivering new services or better services for those existing mobility solutions, whether it's bus, fleet, or otherwise. So that's on the city government side. Sometimes the state government is involved because they're helping to finance what cities are doing in that category, like mobility. Now, increasingly, utilities are at the table, and I notice a growing number of partnerships between cities and utilities where it's not just a municipal-owned utility like you have with Sacramento, and we'll be hearing on October 3rd from SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District's CEO, Arlen, about how they're approaching this whole domain of smart city development in the greater Sacramento region, where they've got more than 1 million or 1.5 million end customers at residential. So that's really interesting new development, as utilities are playing at the table. And so you have essentially a four-cornered transaction. You've got the city, you've got the utility, you've got the telco, who's providing the broadband infrastructure in many cases, if not providing services on top of that. And then you've got the technology provider like SIMCON. Now, not every table is four-cornered. Some of them are just two. Some is just the city and the technology company like SIMCON. But I'm seeing more cases where there are four corners like Sacramento, and that's a new thing which I think bodes well, because even though you have potentially more chefs in the kitchen and therefore maybe more confusion or competing demands or lack of alignment, the reality is that more resources brought to the table, more brain power, more buying power, can lead to a better outcome for everybody, is my own humble opinion. But Chris, off to you for views on who's at the table and why should they be there.
Well, I think you're right. There are many more animators in these projects than before. And I think the challenge that we in the smart city community space, and I'm talking about both public and private sector, have is how do we do a better job of qualifying and quantifying the value proposition? And we're starting to see some initiatives between cities, utilities, and other providers like us and system integrators to really look at a much more granular breakdown. Obviously, energy and sustainability is a big issue, but starting to look at employee productivity and reduce costs from the city or the utility. What's the opportunity to increase revenue with some of these use cases? What about the resident experience? What about resident time savings? Or is there a resident economic impact that needs to be measured? There's obviously public safety elements and others that just can come by virtue of having this, smart infrastructure in place. And there are lots of examples. So we're seeing these ideas and justifications for these types of projects coming from a lot of different places, and many times they're coming from not us in the smart cities practice. The mayors come up with great ideas. We had a really interesting one in February coming from a CIO, which related to senior citizen services and power outages, and we can talk about that some other time. But that's sort of my take is, it's a broadening set of conversations and brainstorming that's starting to happen.
All right, well, that was a really insightful conversation. So thank you both, Chris and Gordon, for joining us. We want to let you guys all know who are on the line still about upcoming events. We have another webinar on our road surface monitoring, which is an application in our Smart City platform, and also another edition of our City Innovators webinar series coming up in October on the complex challenges of securing smart cities. So that'll be an interesting talk with Larry O'Brien about the vulnerability cities face as they deploy more sensors out in the world and what they can do to protect themselves. So that will surely be an interesting conversation. And Gordon, I'll let you talk about your next meeting of the Mind Summit.
Yes, as many of the participants know, we have an annual gathering for 425 plus invited participants, and we'll be convening in Phoenix with partners like Arizona State University and Arizona Commerce, the state agency, and a bunch of private companies participating, as well as grant-making foundations like Arizona Community Foundation. So you can see some details here, and we'd love your suggestions about themes. We published on the website much of the program, but there are still some elements of the program still being shaped. But we always have leaders, C-suite executives from private sector enterprises, including infrastructure and finance, technology companies, of course. We have public agencies participating, and there'll be more than just Arizona public agencies, of course. We always have multiple countries, sometimes more than 10 or 12 represented in the room, and then we'll have philanthropy and university and nonprofit community-based organizations, and the focus and themes will be very much aligned with what we've discussed today's webinar. So people who are interested in what we discussed today will find these sessions over 19 February through 21 February, find them to be particularly appealing. So we'll hope to see some of you there.